last 2 decades or so, we've seen a meteoric rise of technological development globally. Whether we're talking about automation, the gig economy, robotics, or an all-encompassing digital revolution, people all over the world are experiencing rapid changes in the way we live, work, worship, and play. The way we experience one another, the way we receive, store, sell, and disseminate information have all changed dramatically and continues to do so at an exponential rate. The World Economic Forum notes that the Fourth Industrial Revolution represents a fundamental change in the way we live, work, and relate to one another. It is a new chapter in human development enabled by extraordinary technology advances commensurate with those of the first, second, and third industrial revolutions. But perhaps, for me anyway, most significantly, the World Economic Forum emphasizes that the Fourth Industrial Revolution is about more than just technology-driven change. It's an opportunity to help everyone, including leaders, policymakers, and people from all income groups and nations, to harness converging technologies in order to create an inclusive, human-centered future. The real opportunity is to look beyond technology and find ways to give the greatest number of people the ability to positively impact their families, organizations, and communities. To my mind, for this to work, we need to spend some time considering community, inclusion, and equality. Or perhaps the lack of these is the more fundamental conversation. We already know that South Africa is one of the most unequal societies in the world, and this inequality is very acutely experienced when one considers the differences in accessibility to technology and more broadly the internet. This can also be considered from a global perspective when we consider the differences between the West and the rest, affecting the way nations in the global South are able to interact with the rest of the world from a trade, economic, and socio-political perspective. This gap is not only a technological one, but touches on almost every area of human development and agency. Efedo notes, for example, that in the West, genetic sequencing is now unbelievably cheap, and humans and machines are augmenting and assisting each other with knowledge and skills. Meanwhile, there are 4 billion people in the global South who lack reliable internet access. For Africa, the second industrial revolution is yet to be fully experienced, as nearly 1.3 billion people lack access to electricity. The problem rests not with the failure of the third world to catch up to the fourth industrial revolution, but it is how the fourth industrial revolution raises concerns around issues of power asymmetry and the resulting threats of significantly increased inequality, disempowerment, and exploitation. Instead of the internet then bringing communities closer together, there's an inherent risk because of the inequality of access, of widening the gaps between people. And so, how does one ensure that we move into a just and equitable fourth and fifth industrial revolution, which improves the lives of people and places emphasis on community, equality, and human-centered sustainable development? South Africa has attempted to make very useful strides towards improving universal access to the internet. Last year, the Competition Commission, an independent statutory body regulating competition between firms in the market, reached landmark deals with major data providers in the country that dramatically reduced the cost of data. But without adequate infrastructure in many parts of the country and the high cost of smartphones, this has been of little use to many South Africans. And now, with the onset of COVID-19, the class gap in this country and globally is more acute than ever. The wealthier an individual is, the more inherently safer they are from the virus, able to opt out of potentially unsafe daily activities like grocery shopping, whilst millions of people, many of whom are elderly, stand in long, snaking queues to collect social security payments. This has in different quarters of society reignited the call for access to the internet to be considered a human right. And this is my call today. Let us begin again to ask the central questions that will reaffirm the need for internet access to be declared a right in terms of our Constitution, so that citizens are able to take the necessary legal steps to enforce and progressively realize this right. Since the internet became more widely accessible in the 1990s, it's enabled new products and services, improved economic efficiency, transformed access to information, and facilitated better collaboration between governments, business, and citizens. In order for us to begin to leverage the internet in this way, certain things are critical. The main being connectivity and access for all. Recent estimates suggest that less than 10% of people in the least developed countries have access to the internet, compared to more than 80% in developed countries. Of course, like in South Africa, access is particularly poor in rural areas. Second is the question of affordability, with the internet being generally more expensive in relation to the average income in the least developed countries. Of course, this makes it extremely difficult for poorer communities to access internet-enabled services. Lastly, reliability and resilience are critical if governments wish to grow their economies and increase economic opportunities of their citizens. Full participation in the digital economy requires uninterrupted access to the internet. Where this is unavailable, developing and underdeveloped countries will miss out on economic opportunities. Another question that seriously confronts developing countries is the reliable power supply, an issue that has plagued African countries for many years. As a start, it's also important to consider this possibility from a legal lens, from the perspective of South African law, but also international law. The United Nations, as early as 2011, recognized that the internet is a catalyst for a number of human rights, most notably the right to freedom of expression. And in 2016, a report from the Human Rights Council of the United Nations General Assembly declared access to the internet to be a basic human right. And the substance of this really involves two central components. First, access to online content with as few restrictions as possible. And second, and important in the context of emerging nations, availability of the necessary infrastructure and ICTs to enable access to the internet. And for the many who will correctly note that there are other significant rights that we have yet to realize, let us begin to see the right to internet access as an enabler to achieve several other rights. Freedom of expression, also outlined in Section 16 of the South African Constitution, is an enabler of other rights, including the right to education and rights to freedom of association. Notably, the right to freedom of expression and the internet as an enabler of same have a fundamental impact on the ability of citizens to enforce their social, political, and economic rights. This plays a critical role in creating a more equal society where citizens enjoy more equal access to resources and amenities. In addition to this, Section 32 of the South African Constitution provides for a right to access to information, despite not currently providing for an explicit right to internet access. What is significant for me about these rights is that Section 9 of the Constitution, the right to equality, must surely underpin them. If that is the case, are we really on a level playing field in terms of accessing these critical rights? Very recently, we know there has been a significant debate as to whether or not learners should be able to go back to face-to-face learning amidst the COVID-19 pandemic and the significant risk to public health that would go with the opening of schools. Parents of learners attending public schools debated back and forth as to whether or not they believe their children would be safe versus the risk associated with leaving their children out of school. As many parents who were not able to work from home online began to return to work, gruesome stories of child abuse of children left alone at home began to emerge. shifting the issue to one of public safety. Whilst this very public debate waged on, private schools provided their learners with online material which allowed them continuous and uninterrupted access to education. Even today, whilst many schools have adopted a phased approach to learning, many lessons continue online, allowing private schools to significantly minimize risk of mass infections amongst learners. Whilst learners in public schools either take the risk or spend the foreseeable future at home, further widening the gap between rich and poor. And so from this example, it's clear that access to the internet has also begun to intertwine with issues of public health. Another right affected in this time is equal access to justice. One of the key principles in law is that justice must not only be done, but it must be seen to be done. This is why open access to courts is so significant, so that citizens are able to view and learn from various court proceedings happening in our myriad of legal fora. With the onset of COVID-19, many courts have been forced to close their doors, understandably to limit the number of people in a particular space. But where are a number of hearings still happening? Online. As members of the legal profession robe and jump online from the comfort of their studies, ordinary citizens are denied the opportunity to learn from and engage the legal process, a process which must belong to all citizens if it is to be effective in shaping the law to the will of the people. Equal access to affordable or free and reliable internet access could significantly narrow the gap in relation to all of the examples provided. Even before COVID-19, we've seen different and interesting ways in which the internet has been used to hold the state accountable. Notable examples of this were the Arab Spring, which demonstrated new ways of mobilization and news reporting, similarly to the Black Lives Matter and Zimbabwean Lives Matter movements, which demonstrated recently citizens being increasingly vocal about police brutality in the US and in Zimbabwe and South Africa. The #MeToo campaign saw the emergence or resurgence of feminist discourse amongst people all over the world and enabled women globally to begin speaking openly about the atrocities of sexual violence that they have experienced. And these were notoriously secret crimes. The internet has begun to provide victims with a global voice. In 2008, the government of Rwanda embarked on a nationwide rollout of fiber optic as a backbone infrastructure for broadband. This optic fiber connected different parts of the country and provided high-capacity cross-border links with onward connectivity to submarine cables. To help facilitate this initiative to improve the provision of internet access to Rwandan citizens, the International Telecommunication Union and the Rwanda Utilities Regulatory Authority undertook a project to deploy wireless broadband connectivity across the country, with a focus on rural areas specifically. The project is helping to provide free or low-cost digital access for schools, hospitals, and for underserved populations to access online services and information. The network now covers 90% of Rwanda's population. Political will is critically important to achieve these goals. Government should continue to focus its efforts on partnerships with the private sector to achieve similar goals. Google's Project Loon was launched in 2017 to enable the use of giant balloons to bring broader internet access to rural communities. One balloon is the size of a tennis court and are self-sustaining and can provide coverage for over 5,000 square kilometers. These partnerships are useful, but in developing these alliances, government should see them as a temporary solution and use them as a learning opportunity for us to develop our own sustainable solutions. The Competition Commission, in its report relating to the costs of data in South Africa, makes useful recommendations to the state. The main recommendation it makes is that local and national government, under the lead of the Department of Telecommunications, spearheads the development of free public Wi-Fi in low-income areas, including commuter points like train stations and taxi ranks. In my view, this must be more than a recommendation. The Commission has broad powers to make rulings which affect the economic inclusion of South Africans. Although we've not seen significant litigation to this effect, it would be useful to see civil society organizations beginning to make demands on the state through the courts for meaningful realization of a right to internet access as a way of creating a more equal society and a more just fourth industrial revolution. And nothing stops the legislature from legislating to this effect to give citizens an opportunity to begin enforcing progressive realization to a possible right to access to the internet. I would argue, in fact, that the rights to access to information must be developed through case law to include a right to internet access. In fact, should the state not take this seriously, we risk continuing to relegate our population to the corners of economic activity, rendering them post-colonial orphans who cannot effectively compete globally and are perpetually reliant on big international players and lenders. One of my personal mantras by Ralph Waldo Emerson is, "Don't be pushed by your problems, be led by your dreams." In closing, I'm taken back to a memory from earlier this year. One of my first year law students telling the class and a senior member of the legal profession who had come to give them a talk that in high school he had spent hours online watching court hearings and that this is what had inspired him to become a lawyer. The internet gave him access and room to dream, to imagine. South Africa, like many emerging countries, has significant challenges moving side by side with untapped potential. The internet is not only a rights enabler, but used properly, it is a dream enabler. If we are to begin to solve our problems, we must surely grow and enable problem solvers, dreamers. So I want to propose, to insist, that the state begins to put our dreamers first, our young people, our foot soldiers of change. Ensure that they all equally have space to read, to learn, to think, to grow, to discard old ideas and stereotypes, to complain and rant, to be, to imagine, to dream, so that they can begin the work of changing their own circumstances, the lives of their family, and the destinies of their people.